there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's a sunny December morning in 2014, just 10 days before Christmas. And Louisa Hope and her 72-year-old mother Robin are up early for an appointment in Sydney CBD. They're in Martin Place to see a family lawyer. And at the bottom of the building their meeting is in sits the popular Lindt Café. They pop inside for a coffee and a slice of toast after getting to their destination early. Just after 8:30am, Robin notices a man lingering. She remarks to her daughter that he looks out of place. He's talking to the cafe's manager, who looks tense. After noting the interaction as odd, the mother and daughter continue on with their breakfast. They even order a second coffee before attempting to pay and be on their way. It's then, at 9:44am, that man Haron Monis addresses the cafe full of morning commuters. He has a bomb in his backpack, he says, and as of this moment, they are all his hostages. I want to speak to the Prime Minister of Australia, he demands, on national radio.
Just got some breaking news. There's a police operation underway in the heart of the city.
This gunman is quite well known to police, in fact.
There are dozens and dozens of police. Some are very heavily armed in helmets and Kevlar suits. So I could see inside the Lindt building a woman with her hands up against the glass.
I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. It's been 10 years since the Sydney siege brought Australia and the world to a standstill. A man brandishing a gun who claimed to have a bomb holding 10 customers and 8 employees of the Lindt Café in Martin Place hostage for 16 hours. 2 innocent lives were lost during that terrifying day and night. The manager of the cafe, a man named Tori Johnson, was executed by Monis as tactical police swarmed in just after 2am. Barrister and mother of 3, Katrina Dawson, was killed in the crossfire. It's a crime that's been dissected at length over the past decade, with criticism of the police handling of the event at the forefront. I have a personal connection to this story. I was a young radio journalist working the night shift at 2GB Macquarie Radio. I covered the final hours of the siege on the hour as the national newsreader for the network. I did so with a police negotiator by my side and a reporter at the scene feeding back information. It's a story and a crime I think about often, especially as we unpack in today's episode, as the media's role in the siege has come under scrutiny. Today's guest is true crime author and podcaster Vikki Petratis, who alongside her co-host Emily Webb are revisiting the siege as we commemorate this anniversary in a series called The Unthinkable, a Case File Presents podcast hosted by Acast. They tell the story through 2 lenses, that of a hostage survivor and that of a TOU operative that we've only been able to name in full in recent days. Ben Besant is the TOU officer who shot Monis dead in those final moments of the siege. His name has been suppressed, an order that was made at the time to protect him, but has become a burden and a shackle over time, only further exacerbating his PTSD from the event. It was lifted by the New South Wales Supreme Court on the 29th of November 2024. Vikki joins us now to take us back to the start. Vikki, tell me about the decision to revisit this story on the 10-year anniversary and how you decided to do that.
At first, the entree into this story was Ben Besant, who's now reclaimed his name. He was the TOU operative who took down the terrorist, and he had gotten in touch with Case File, who I work for, and wanted to tell his story. We got in touch with Ben and we started to research him, read his book, Tiger, 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 and one of the YouTube clips that we looked at was Louisa Hope talking at Ben's launch. And there is something about Louisa that you just, are mesmerised by her, the way that she speaks, the dignity. Oh, my goodness, she's amazing. And so I said to Ben, could we get Louisa's number? And so he cleared that with Louisa. And just talking to her, we knew that she would be an episode on her own. And Louisa's one of these people, I think, that thinks, are people really interested? Hell yeah. And so we spent the most amazing day with Louisa, and we were just captivated by her. And that's how we came to do both of them.
Yeah, so you tell the story from two sides, really, a hostage's side and then a TOU or police officer's side of things. Where were you when this siege was unfolding? I feel like this is one of those stories or those crimes in our history where those of us who lived through it kind of know where we were. It's one of those kinds of ones.
Look, it's a great question because I'm in Melbourne, and so while it came onto your radar that there's a siege in the Lindt Café, I don't know Sydney. My best friend lives in Sydney, and I know the suburb she lives in, and I don't know anything else. And so I really, I guess like most Melburnians, it comes up on the news and people start to talk about it, but it's not something where, like, I think I could tell you where I was when Melbourne things happened, but it's that little bit further removed. So for me, it was just sort of watching it on the news. And then, of course, it became iconic, didn't it, when we all remember seeing the hostages taking flight. And I think all of us remember those iconic shots of them fleeing in terror and then being scooped into the arms of the tactical operations unit people, so Ben and his buddies, and almost like they come flying out and then they're scooped in to safety. And I think those kind of images, they don't leave you, do they?
Let's tell the story a little bit because it has been 10 years. For those that have forgotten the details, man Haron Monis took the occupants of the Lindt Café hostage on the morning of December 15th. Can you walk us through what his demands and threats were?
So he had come into the cafe, I think at around 8:30, and had breakfast. And at the end of the breakfast, so he was there for over an hour before he made it known that he was going to take them all hostage. And what was really fascinating talking to Louisa was that her mother had him pegged. And I loved in the interview where her mother's saying, Louisa, that man, he doesn't belong. What's he doing here? And Louisa goes to look. Don't look. You know how every mum does that. Don't look, Louisa. And so Louisa's trying to get surreptitious glances at this guy, but he didn't belong. And there was something about his demeanour that Louisa's mum picked up. So I think it was like 9:40 where he asks one of the wait staff to talk to the manager. And really, it's kind of 10 to 10 before he stands up with the gun and says, I want the doors locked and you're all hostages. And what he wanted, I think his demands were odd, but I guess they made sense to him. But what he wanted was to engage in dialogue with the Prime Minister, and he wanted to send out the message that, Australia was under attack and the Islamic State, he was very much a self-identifying terrorist, and that he wanted to know that Sydney and Australia was under attack, and he wanted that publicised. And, of course, what happened was all of the 18 hostages were left really to do this mad scramble. I mean, how do you call the Prime Minister? How do you do that? Call the ABC. I don't know their number. So all of the hostages were left to try and service these demands that were never, ever going to be met. I think Monis wanted a on-air debate with the Prime Minister. That's never going to happen. I think the police, law enforcement will never, ever bend to the will of terrorists, because if you can get the Prime Minister on air, then, I don't know, next week we're going to have another terror attack, and they know that they can just point a gun at someone and get the Prime Minister on the line. And so I think that there's an unwillingness with law enforcement to ever bend to the will or the demands of someone like Monis.
We've talked about Louisa and her mum being two of the hostages. Who else was in that cafe? It was a real mixture of people, wasn't it?
Yeah, so the Lindt Café staff I think there was 8 of them and 10 hostages. So we had Katrina Dawson and 2 of her law colleagues. There were 4 people that worked at Westpac Bank, and there was Louisa and her mum. And then there was John O'Brien, who was the 82-year-old retired tennis player. And so you have this really eclectic, from young to old, this mix of people in the cafe. And then you have the wait staff themselves, really young people that were left to do an extraordinary job of being able to stay alive when there was someone like Monis holding a gun at them all day.
You have spent a significant amount of time with Louisa, kind of talking through her recollections of that time. It is 10 years after the fact. How did you find her recollection of that time and her memories and what she spoke about?
I think with trauma, it's like you can close your eyes and you are there. And I think that this is a really common response, that it is as real today for that kind of huge trauma as it was the day that it happened. And what I found really interesting about Louisa was that she has spent, I guess, 10 years trying to piece together the whole story, because she talks about knowing her bit, but found out stuff at the inquest about, I didn't know that. And then I think at one point she had sort of thrown herself on the ground right before the shooting starts, but then she's standing up again and she's like, I don't understand how I went from lying down to standing up. And the other day she said to me, I think I remember that now. And so for her, it's not about a fading memory. I think it is about a building memory that you're trying to reconstruct the whole event. And I guess that's always just to make sense of it, isn't it?
Can you take us inside that cafe? What was it like in there? Obviously there was a lot of fear, but it went on for 16 hours or so. So a lot of emotions, a lot of kind of differing opinions and emotions are going to be present during that time.
Absolutely. I think that when the hostage situation first happened, there's that sense of disbelief. And Louisa talks about, is this a Channel 7 like prank show? Channel 7's just across the way. Is this a joke? And I think it became very quickly obvious that it wasn't. But Louisa talks about the fact that 1 minute Monis would be speaking to her in a way that's interested in her, and she has multiple sclerosis, so he was saying, tell me about that. But she said equally the next minute he could be grabbing her and pointing the gun at her head, threatening to shoot her. And so I guess that it was for the hostages, this is what they all would have seen. They would have seen calm and then explosive and demanding. But at the same time, well, I think the whole day they would have just been absolutely on edge, because he's got the gun and he's saying that he's wearing a bomb and he's threatening to kill them. And so I can only just imagine what that would have been like. And then you had some of the hostages, Marcia and Selena especially, were really trying to, and they copped a lot of criticism for this, which is awful. But they were trying to say, well, if you want us to put stuff on social media, or, we'll try and get your demands met, because they knew that it meant their life. And I remember afterwards people criticising that, and I thought, you didn't walk a mile in their shoes, and these people were all doing the best that they could to live. And I think they all did an awesome job at trying to navigate around the horror that they found themselves in.
Because the reality was he had a gun, but he also claimed to have a bomb or a few bombs. But Louisa speaks to you about how she was a bit wary of that information from the start.
Yeah. So, and it was her mum that said he didn't look like he was carrying a bomb. And Louisa's like, how would my mum know what someone looks like carrying a bomb? But I think, she talks about, I think she was right in the fact that he wasn't being over. I guess if you had a bomb on your back, your movements would be a little bit tentative because you might blow yourself up. But he didn't seem to act and move like he had something that could explode. And I think that's what her mum ended up talking about. But I think we have to remember 10 years down the track that the operatives that were preparing to go in thought they were going to die, thought that he would explode a bomb. And so the whole siege had to be treated like he did have a bomb, even though the two other bombs that he said were around Sydney, I think Circular Quay and somewhere else, that there weren't. But he was treated like it was a bomb. And that changed everything. And this is why the police were really reluctant to go in, because then everybody dies. If he sets off the bomb, they all die. And so I think we forget that. And there was even comments on social media the other day after Ben did his beautiful Spotlight interview, and just some really thoughtless comments of people who obviously didn't watch the show. Oh, the police were cowards, this, that and the other. But really, the courage that it took for them to go in, thinking that they would not survive it, and getting their partners to send pictures of their children was, brings a tear to the eye, because they didn't think they would survive. So it wasn't about courage, it was about risk.
All of that is a side of the story that we learnt months, years, some of it a decade later. If we go back to the siege itself, I want to talk about the media's role, because we live in a 24-hour news cycle. The police were on the scene very quickly, but so too were the media. The world's media was watching this siege unfold in Sydney. Louisa explained to you how damaging some of that coverage was. Can you explain what she meant by that and what the hostages were so upset about inside?
So they had access to radio interviews inside the cafe. There was a TV, but I think it was one of those display ones that just showed the ads, and they said, no, we can't get TV. So in the days 10 years ago, you probably couldn't watch it on your phone. So he was listening to the media coverage of it. And at one point, around sort of 3-ish, John O'Brien escaped. Stefan, one of the lawyers, and Paolo, one of the wait staff, escaped and went racing out the building. And Monis had threatened to shoot anyone if anyone else escaped. And then 2 girls, Ellie and April, who were really young, and they were terrified, and one of them had vomited, like it was physical manifestations of the terror that they were facing. And the 2 girls had sort of crawled over to near the door, and Jared Morton Hoffman had sort of nudged the Lindt bear, the big poster of the Lindt bear, in front of them, and they were undoing the bolts on the door, and they raced out. And Monis didn't notice. He didn't ever do a head count, and he didn't notice that they were gone. And then the media starts reporting. And Louisa talks specifically about this lovely woman from the BBC, this lovely English voice saying 2 more hostages have escaped. And he hears it and he says, what? Where are they? And so all of the hostages, and this is where the roles had to be, no, brother. He made them call him brother. No, brother, the media are just lying. No other hostages escaped. But she's thinking, this woman in England is talking about something that could get me killed. And so Louisa herself is a great fan of the freedom of the press. But in this case, she highlights the fact that information that he was listening to that he did not know could have got her killed. And she says, if it's a question of media freedom versus my life, I think we need to look at this, and we need to be better at not jeopardising. I don't know what the fix is, because the media, there's no way they're going to not report on that. But it just highlighted just how risky that was for the people in the cafe.
To give another perspective, I was working in radio at the time at 2GB, Macquarie Radio, which is actually one of the stations Monis was listening to for updates. So I was the newsreader overnight, into the 2 a.m., into all of it. And I actually had a police negotiator next to me as I wrote my scripts who was checking what I was putting out there. So at the time, I felt safe in that because I was in my early 20s at the time, but I had a senior cop telling me, take that out, leave that in. But we were all reporting 5 hostages have left the building, thinking that that was okay. So it just goes to show that even, the police negotiator that I had in my newsroom wasn't aware of what the hostages needed in that moment, perhaps.
Of course, they wouldn't have been aware. But what you have, and I think talking to Louisa really brought this home, and then watching interviews with the others, is that this small group of people who were mostly strangers to each other are inside that cafe being left to deal with. They had no expertise in hostage negotiation, and they were left to deal with this on their own, and no one would have known. But I think in the early reporting, when Louisa said, we just said to him, the media are just lying to make you look bad, brother. And I think he went, fair enough. That was a palatable truth for him to accept. And so I don't think any reporting later on put them in jeopardy because they had said, no, they're just lying. But that media, you can't trust the media, which of course played into his, I guess, paranoia.
I want to timeline the day a bit because we've spoken about several hostages escaping. Monis kind of holds everyone hostage at 10. By 11 o'clock, we've got tactical police surrounding. By 3:30 p.m, we've got 3 hostages escaping. 2 more escape at 5 p.m. But it's not until 2 a.m. that everything kind of comes to a head. Can you tell us about that really next 13 minutes? What happened to end the siege?
Oh my goodness, it's really quite a distressing thing to hear the people that were involved. So we had Louisa on the inside and we had Ben on the outside, and we had these 2 perspectives. And I think while the police negotiators and a psychiatrist that they had advising them said that things were calming down, it was going against, Tori Johnson was sending texts to his family during this time going, he's agitated, he's going to kill someone. All the hostages that had left had said, he's agitated, he's unhinged, he's going to kill someone. And the psychiatrist and some of the negotiators, there was actually kind of disturbing footage of them being inadvertently recorded, sort of saying, no, he won't hurt anyone. He's someone that will outsource that because of his background, and we'll talk more about sort of the criminology or the crime history that he brought to the cafe. But they had ignored the hostages, I think, and they said he'll settle down for the night. And there was no evidence to suggest that he wasn't becoming increasingly, he would have been sleep deprived, he would have been agitated, he's not getting anywhere, hostages are running out the door. And so what I think Monis had heard some noises out the back in the kitchen, and he took Fiona and Selena and Jared out to the kitchen, and he wanted the girls to stack boxes, but they were empty boxes, so it wouldn't have blocked anyone coming through the door, but he wanted these boxes stacked in front of the door. And that was the first time that he had left the main body of the cafe. And so he sent Jared back out again, and he said, you guard the door. And Jared kind of went, we've got to run. We've got to run. And so he gathered, he's gesturing because you can't make a noise, but he's like, come on. And they just, 6 hostages bolted for the door and were able to escape. But someone knocked a glass over on the way out, and he runs out and fires at them. And you can see the CCTV of them fleeing, and then you see the shattering of the shot that he's firing on them. And certainly the TOU thought that that's when they would get the call. He's fired a shot, but they don't. And so Monis goes back into the cafe, and it's this time that he tells Tori Johnson to get down on his knees. he gets Louisa and her mother Robin, who's 71, sort of flanking him, and he shoots Tori. He fires a shot first where it's above Tori's head, and Tori falls forward, and then sort of slowly, he's incredibly distressed, and he gets back onto his knees, and then he's executed. And it's almost like you wonder if Monis is saying, well, I'll fire above him. Maybe the police will come in. Maybe I can have my shootout with the police. But the police still don't come in. And then he kills Tori Johnson. So in the minutes after that, they finally get the call to go in. And it's pandemonium. You can also watch videos of the team that's coming in through the foyer, and they're throwing flashbang devices. They're sort of bouncing off the walls, and they're interfering with their ability to enter. And then, of course, Ben and his team are at the front. They're the Alpha team, and they're trying to fire through the glass door to get the broken glass, and then they get a clear shot at the terrorist. But they didn't realise that the glass was bulletproof because Lindt used to be a bank. And so it took a number of shots, like bang, 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 before the glass finally shatters. And then Ben talks to us on the podcast about that moment where the glass shatters and he's eye to eye with the offender. And then that he just starts shooting. But Monis is firing back. So Ben is fully expecting not only to get blown up, but he's fully expecting with this guy firing a shotgun at him just across a cafe. There's no distance. And I think he fired 2 shots at them, and Ben just kept shooting until Monis went down. And, of course, this all takes a couple of seconds, but the inquest would rake over that for many years afterwards.
There was another fatality when all of that gunfire was happening, when the police finally barged through that door, and that was Katrina. She died in that. And then there were a number of hostages and also a cop that got injured as well.
Katrina was lying on the floor with sort of under a group of stacked tables, and I guess tables are going to be no shield against bullet fragments. And this is one of the great tragedies at the loss of Katrina Dawson, who's a young mum, a lawyer, full of life and every hope for the future. But what Ben was originally told was that she died of a police bullet. And he was just sick with the thought that he could have killed her. You know, he's firing with a laser right at the target, and he's like, how could it have happened? He fires 17 shots, his colleague fires 5, and they're the only shots that are fired in the direction of Katrina. And then later on that day, they are told that Katrina has died from fragments, so bullets going through the gunman, hitting their target, but then shattering, and she's been hit with shrapnel. And I said to Ben, I remember a really emotional part of the interview, I said, did that make any difference? And he just looked at me and he goes, what do you think? And I went, no. And he goes, no. And so I think the heartache and the trauma and the tragedy was that he took on the blame completely for killing Katrina Dawson. And then, of course, she dies in his arms. So that just, you know, it's beyond belief, isn't it? The kind of trauma that happens when someone like Monis does what he does.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with true crime author and co-host of the Unthinkable podcast, Vikki Petratis. After the break, we talk about the bravery of Tori and Katrina, the 2 victims who were killed that night. I want to touch a bit more on Katrina and Tori while we're here. Can you tell us a bit more about them? Tori in particular showed incredible bravery during that siege, didn't he?
I think when they interviewed his Lindt colleagues afterwards and his family, and they talked about what an awesome person he was. But the prevailing memory for me is that he sat with Louisa's mum, Robin, And Louisa talked about during the day they would be sitting and holding hands. She talks about being a little bit like, what are you doing? And giggling. And she goes, now I understand that he sat with my mum to calm her down and to keep her settled and to keep her anchored. Because at one point when Robin had challenged the terrorist and he had turned to Louisa and said, Louisa, keep your mother quiet. Louisa's like, if only I could, because you can't keep your mum quiet. So she felt that Tori just sat with her mum. And when the others fled and her mum said, Tori, you run. And he goes, I'm not leaving you. And so there was this understanding that, and Louisa said, no greater love has a man than to lay down his life for a friend. And I think that's what he did. So such a horrible loss. And he was so scared and he was texting his family. And another tragedy, of course, is that he's texting his mum saying, I love you and I'm a hostage. And the police are saying, don't text him back.
And then we've got Katrina, who had 3 young children at home, who was, a very successful lawyer and had, all these amazing friends and family and colleagues who loved her.
Yeah. And that is such a great tragedy. And I one of the interviews that I just saw recently, people were saying Katrina was using her legal skills during the day to kind of keep the terrorists calm. And I hadn't heard that before. And then Fiona Ma talks about, she was another 19-year-old wait staff at Lindt, and she talks about she was such a great comfort to everybody. Fiona was cool and calm, and she talks about that there being 2 types of people in the cafe, ones that would need to be kept calm and ones that would calm others. And she described Katrina as one who kept her calm. And I've heard so many people talk about Fiona as the one that kept them calm. But I thought, that's such an interesting take on the fact that when they would go off to the toilet, because Fiona was the one that was tasked to take all of them to the toilet. And she talked about the fact that, Katrina and her would have these conversations in the toilet where she felt calmer. So, yeah, such a great tragedy.
We've touched on the criticism that started very, very early on. Why aren't the police going in? Why aren't they stopping him? Why aren't they helping the hostages? Can you take us outside to Ben's position? He was out the front of the Lindt Café waiting, gun in hand. What were his orders? Why weren't they going in?
They weren't allowed to go in because of the bomb. And so in a hostage situation, you can go in an emergency entry, which is what emergency action, an EA, or a deliberate action. So they had planned a deliberate action, and I think the army had weighed in on that, and they had rehearsed it and set up a mock Lindt Café, and the deliberate action plan had not been approved. And I think they felt like, according to Ben's book, there felt like a bit of a disconnect between the people in charge of the operation and then the tactical people who are trained in this kind of operation. There felt like a disconnect in the understandings of, I think maybe if the tactical operations unit had been in charge, they would have done it differently. But I think there was always going to be criticism, but it was the bomb. It was the presence of the bomb that, in fact, we now know didn't exist. But it was the presence of the bomb that changed everything, because the concern was that they would all die and that they would lose all the hostages and their tactical group.
At what point did the tactical group, or does Ben say the tactical group, wanted to go in?
They wanted to go in straight away. From the minute they got there, they're like, let us at him. There was a sniper, and I'd seen him interviewed. He might have been in a bank across the other way, and he's wanting to take a shot. But now that we know that the glass was bulletproof, even if you had taken a shot from the other side of the building during the day, that could have just bounced off the glass. It may not have been a successful shot, and that could have precipitated. It's just so hard trying to predict the mind and actions of a madman who is on a suicide mission.
Let's move on to the inquest, because it was huge, to say the least. It went for many weeks and months, and all eyes were on it because there was so much criticism about how the police handled this crime. Firstly, what did the inquest uncover about Monis and his background and how the police treated his background?
This is still contentious because Monis was on bail, and he was on bail for really significant crimes. So he was on bail for the stalking. Originally, he'd been charged with and found not guilty of the stalking of his ex-wife, the mother of his 2 little children. And within a year of him being found not guilty of that, she was murdered. And she was murdered by Amira Drudas, who, of course, was Monis's partner. And Amira Drudas had stabbed her 18 times and set her on fire as she came to collect the children that Monis had kind of on the other side of town, out of the way, creating an alibi for himself. So months after that, that was in April of 2013, and then months after, they are both charged, and Amira Drudas is charged with the murder, and Monis is charged with accessory to murder. And he spends a month in jail and then he's bailed. But he was also on probation for sending disturbing letters to the families of soldiers in Afghanistan, and he'd been charged with that and he was on probation. So then you also have in around sort of 2007, 2008, he had committed sexual assault on, we don't know how many clients of his fake spiritual business. And so he's on bail for the accessory to murder, and then he's charged with, I think, 43 counts of aggravated sexual assault. And he's bailed again. This is all happening in the October, and then by December, he takes a gun and we find him in Lindt. And so I think the natural question for everybody was, what the hell? Why was this guy, what does probation mean if you can commit an accessory to murder or get charged with it, and people, the courts putting the freedom of a man like that over the safety of pretty much everyone in his space because no one is safe from him. And this became contentious later on, and I know Louisa is so angry about this, because when he took the 2 women out to the kitchen, so they left for the first time that day and took the women out to the kitchen, she read something in his behaviour that she was terrified that he was going to sexually assault them. There was something that she basically squeezed her eyes shut and prayed, dear God, don't let him hurt those 2 young women. And I think that's why she missed the initial scrambling of the escape, because she had her eyes squeezed shut praying for these 2 girls.
Well, it was basically determined that Monis wasn't overly dangerous in this Lindt Café situation. They didn't think he would actually kill because, one, he was an accessory, he didn't murder, and then they weren't taking into account all of these sexual assaults. That's a violent act.
Yeah. And even the violence, and you can watch footage of this, has been reported where he is filming his children on the day that his wife is about to be murdered by Amira Drudas. And obviously they've planned, hey, here's a knife, here's fuel, because she put, I think it was petrol on her and set her on fire. So this is an act that they would have both planned together. And he says, I'll be over the other side of town. And the fact that he's filming his kids playing and laughing and looking at them thinking, I'm just about to murder your beloved mother. I mean, that's pretty cold. And I don't know, if you've got that in you, you've got it in you. But this constant sort of downplaying by the people that were making the decisions, oh, no, he's not dangerous. And every indicator and every escaped hostage is screaming, he's dangerous. And they just, some of them were described as, oh, well, they're just hysterical. Like, yeah, because he's dangerous.
Up next, I ask Vikki what some of the biggest revelations after the Sydney siege were. There were 45 findings from the inquest, which is an insane amount. But what did the inquest find in regards to this?
Look, I think the most important findings, all the people that I've interviewed, were the ones that weren't found, because the bail, the whole why he was on bail, that wasn't something that people felt in interviews was addressed. I think that everybody just wanted to say, if this happens again, are we prepared for it? Because that's a concern that Louisa had when she said, they did so many things that could have been done better. Are they prepared for it next time? So I think the criticism of the whole inquest that I've heard was that it didn't address publicly the things that it needed to. So, of course, all the tactical stuff was not addressed openly, and I think that was one of the main difficulties for people involved. It didn't feel closed.
When you say it wasn't open, a lot of it was under suppression, so the public didn't get to hear it.
Yeah. So with the suppression around, tiptoeing around all of the tactical stuff, one thing that really stood out to me was when Louisa and her mum were sitting in court and they heard that the only way that the police would go in under an emergency action is if someone was in the immediate threat of dying or if someone had been killed. And Louisa talks about her mother turning to her and saying, Louisa, they were never coming for us. And that realisation, Louisa said, she goes, I think it broke something in my mum that day, that she realised that you could be taken hostage in the heart of Sydney and the police are never going to come in until one of you dies.
Has that changed since the siege, though?
I don't know. I really hope it has, because I think that all of them were sitting there all day saying, the police are coming, we know they're there, they're going to come and get us, they're going to come and rescue us, and they just didn't. And I think that's why when it hits that sort of 2 a.m. and he has an opportunity to run, he just says run, because I think they had lost all hope after 16 hours that the police, who are standing right outside, aren't coming in. But, of course, I don't think anyone understood the pressure of someone like Ben. This is why it's great to hear his story when he says they wanted us to go in, we wanted to go in, we just didn't get the order. And all of them have talked about, can we just go in anyway? Can we just do it? But, of course, they can't. They're under orders. And so that whole wanting to go in, it had nothing to do with bravery. It had nothing to do with the desire to not go in. They wanted to go in and the hostages wanted them to go in, just didn't get the order.
Some of the other findings from the inquest were they did find that they should have taken action earlier. By earlier, they mean 2:03, not 2:13. There was a basic failure from the hostage calls who were trying to get out to the negotiators at one point because they were in a handover. So they were missing the calls from the hostages. There was a finding that the negotiators lacked experience in a domestic siege situation. It was ruled that Katrina Dawson's death was an accident, that there was no excessive force by police. We've mentioned the bail application. That was found to be inadequate. And there was a lack of a media deal that kind of compromised safety. It was another finding, which are all kind of things, tick, 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 we wanted to see. Another one was that snipers were unduly restricted. But I guess you can make all of these findings. The point is, did anything change? Has anything changed since? Would this just happen again?
It's the big question, isn't it? Would it happen again? I don't know. I don't know how prepared we can be for something like that. And it's interesting to see for the 10th anniversary, senior police being interviewed, and they all talk about what did we learn from this. And hopefully, of course, they don't want this to happen again. I think this has affected everybody. And I would hope that this wouldn't happen again. But these cases are such individual cases, aren't they? We had a case in Melbourne where a man just drives down the Bourke Street Mall and just runs people over. I mean, until this happens, you can never imagine it happening. And once it has, you're scrambling to say, what can we learn from it? But until the next unbelievable thing happens, we're still, I don't know. You would see it in the media. You just go, who would have thought that thing would have happened? And then it does. And you just learn lessons, but those lessons may or may not be applicable to the next unusual thing that happens.
What have been the ramifications for both sides, for the hostages and for the people like Ben that were on the other side? What have their lives looked like in the last 10 years?
I think all of them would have been changed that night, and all of them would have been left to deal with the fallout. Ben's fallout was in particular the fact that I think he seems a little bit traumatised from actually shooting the terrorist, because he talks about, even though that was his goal, was to take down somebody, but when he's looking down on somebody who he has killed, you don't do that without it making a difference to you. And certainly the death of Katrina, I think that's still something that if you talk to him about that, the emotion just rises to the surface as it would. And that's something that he may never be able to free himself from. He's certainly doing all of the work to free himself of the absolute and utter torture and blame. And his ramifications will go on forever. Somebody like Louisa, I think her learning from this and her generosity is something that she will continue to develop. And she speaks of course, she's angry at things like the bail, and of course she's angry at things that happened, but at the same time, her generosity and her ability to thrive moving forward is just awesome to watch. And I don't think any of them, I mean, physically, she didn't remain unscathed. Her mother didn't remain unscathed. Her mother took shrapnel to the shoulder and it took her hearing in one of her ears, and Louisa was hit with shrapnel as well. And so along with the scars of the injuries that pretty much most of the people that were in the cafe when the police came in were injured. But I think they carry so many things, like the people that escaped early. I've seen interviews with them when they talk about the guilt that they carry, that they got out early. And I loved Louisa's response when I asked her about that. She said that is not their burden to carry.
You and your co-host talk about how it is a big ethical question. Like, do you stay or do you leave and potentially put them at risk? Like, it is a big thing to kind of grapple with. Well, not in Louisa's eyes anyway.
Well, in her eyes, she said those men escaped. They had families. They had, two of them, I think, had little children. And she said, of course, they need to do the best thing that they can do for themselves and their families. And she said that is not their burden to carry. And I thought, what a generous way of looking at that, in saying, I don't hold a grudge. And it's one that you just don't know what you do unless you're in that situation. I think the two young girls that escaped were so utterly terrified, vomit sick terrified, that they just had to get out. And so who knows how you would react in that situation.
Ben has only written his book, his side of things, in recent years. And reflecting on it myself, I would argue that many people's opinions of the siege would be stuck from the time that it happened. You know, in their heads, it's the criticism of the police, it's the thinking of the hostages. They're not thinking from Ben's side of things or that side of things. Do you think that's why it's so important 10 years on to continue talking about this, to elevate the stories that we perhaps haven't heard all these years on?
Oh, definitely. Like you were saying, you've covered the case and you're learning things. And I think that's the same. It would be the same for Louisa and Ben, that they're learning things from each other and they're learning things from the 10th anniversary, and they might see interviews that they might go, oh, that's a piece of the puzzle that I didn't know. But I think that when you revisit them, we don't revisit them to, it's not salacious. We revisit this to tell a story of trauma and survival. And we tell the story to commemorate the ones that were lost. And I think if this can happen in the heart of the city and you don't commemorate it, where's your heart? So I always think these stories are important to tell.
There have been a number of changes that have come into place since the siege unfolded in 2014. I wanted to touch on a few of them. In 2017, the New South Wales government passed a law which allows the Commissioner to authorise lethal force in a terrorism event. Bail laws were changed so that someone must be refused if they're fighting a terrorism charge. The Australian Defence Force now have a team of combat-trained commandos stationed in Sydney in response to the criticism they didn't coordinate well on the night with local police. And New South Wales Police have overhauled a number of strategies. They've invested in more weapons and armour. Their negotiating unit looks completely different, and their terror strategies now allow them to more aggressively pursue armed offenders, even before heavily armed tactical officers arrive, which is something we saw being used earlier this year when Inspector Amy Scott fatally shot the man responsible for the Bondi Junction stabbing spree in April. Many would argue more could be done in regards to the laws, the police, and even the media's involvement in events such as this. But 10 years on, top police say it's an event in our nation's history that they do continue to learn from. Thanks to Vikki Petratis for helping us to tell this story. The first 5 episodes of The Unthinkable are out now and available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Episodes are released every Sunday. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, and Tahli Blackman, with audio design by Jacob Round. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.